grand third graders. It's Ms. Jaimeo, and I want to work with you on using your newfound rounding skill to find differences using estimation. So if you go ahead and you take out your Envision math book, you're going to need a piece of paper along with your hardback Envision's math book, and you also might want to use, or I would highly suggest that you use, your multiples of 10 chart. That's going to be a good resource for you to use to help you with this particular assignment. So if we go ahead and get started, you're going to turn to page 50 and 51 in your math book. It should read up at the top, estimating differences. And the beginning problem gives you a word problem, and it says, all of the tickets for a concert were sold. So far, 126 people have arrived at the concert. About how many people who have tickets have not arrived? So they're giving you, when we're subtracting, think back to whole, part, and part. So we know what the whole is. We know all the tickets were sold, right? We want to make sure we find one of the parts in this particular word problem, which would be the tickets that were sold, which would be 126, and we want to know about how many are going to be left. So when we're subtracting, this is the idea that we want to think about. This is our difference that we're trying to find, the difference. That's a vocabulary word that we should have in our lexicon. What we call our lexicon is our vocabulary. So in our vocabulary, we want to have the difference to a subtraction equation. So in this particular case, there were 493 tickets sold, and if you look at the picture, that's where I'm getting that information from. It says 490 total tickets. Total tickets. And from those total tickets, I want to subtract 126 of those total tickets. So when I go to subtract, I'm going to, these are the people that have arrived. Oh, people that have arrived. And we are going to find the estimated people who have not arrived. Not arrived. So this is the part that have arrived. These are the parts that have not arrived. These are my total people or total tickets sold. So we want to estimate this. And they're asking us to estimate this by rounding to the closest 100. So 493, rounded to the closest 100. We have 400 here. And we know the next 100, when we look at our multiples of 10 chart, at each end of that row is our hundreds. So right in the middle, when we're rounding to the closest 100, is 50. So we look at our tens place, and we can see that 493 is going to be maybe somewhere around here. Not exactly, but we could get pretty close, especially if we use our multiples of 10 chart. We can see that 493 is past 450. So we can say that it's going to round to 500. Now, when we look at people that have arrived and we want to round to the closest 100 with the people that have arrived, we look at the hundreds place, and that number is between 100 and the next 100 after 100 is 200. Remember that 50 is in between two groups of 100, right in the middle, and we use 50 as our benchmark to decide Are we going to round up to 200 or down to 100? So if we look at our tens place, we see 20, and 120 might be right around here somewhere, 126. So noticing that it's less than 150, we're going to round down to 100. So when we go to subtract this, these are the tickets rounded. These are the number of people that have arrived, it's been rounded to the closest 100. And when we subtract, we know that 500 minus 100 is about 400. Okay? So let's think, we're going to say about 400 here have not arrived. So now let's take a look at, if we were to find the exact difference, would that match what our estimate is here? So if I take 493 and I subtract 100, I would get 300. And 90 minus the 20, I subtract 2 tens from here, so 80 and one more 10 is 70. And then I have my ones, but I need to borrow and regroup that as 10 to make 13, which is going to give me 7. So once I put this back together as a whole number, that would give me 367. Now, is this 367 close to 400? Yes, this would be a close estimate, especially if you're rounding to the closest 100. So now I want to take a look at the actual assignment within the page, starting on page 51. And if we look at page 51 and want to start you off on this assignment, so I'm going to look at 1 through 6 to start off. And number 1, we have 321 minus 112. Now, to kind of streamline this, what I want to do is let's just focus in on, we're going to just estimate. We're not going to worry about finding the exact difference. We can start working towards that, but for right now, I think what I want to do is let's use our newfound skill of rounding and let's estimate these differences. And we won't worry so much today about finding the exact difference, but just rounding to estimate. So, if you notice that 321, if I were to round 321 to the nearest 100, because that's what it asks us to do in the directions for 1 and 2, we look at the hundreds place, we see that it's going to be between 300 and the next 100, which is going to be 400, and we know that 350 is in our middle. I changed up my little number line here, but that's still okay. 321 might fall right around here somewhere. And so we notice that it's less than 350. And since it's less than 350, that tells us that it's going to be closer, and we're going to estimate it to 300. So if we go ahead and show our work here, we're going to round 321 to the nearest 100, which is 300. If I take 112, it's going to be between 100 and the next 100, which is 200. I'm going to use my middle point of 150 to decide which 100 it's closer to. So if I look at my tens place here, I know that 112 is going to be less than, because 12 is less than 50, so 112 is going to round to 100 as the closest 100. So now let's just go ahead and subtract our difference here. Our numbers are 300 minus 100, and that gives us a difference of 200. So this is going to be about 200 when we actually go to subtract the final exact amount for our subtraction sentence. Okay, so we're not going to worry about finding the exact difference today. We're just going to focus in on rounding. So let's look at number 2. Again, we're rounding to the closest 100. So I have 255. That's my total, or my whole. I'm subtracting 189. That's part of this whole, and we want to know what's going to be the other missing part, or the difference between 189 up to 255. That's where we get the word difference from, is how many numbers separate 189 up to 255. That is our difference. So I'm going to, again, use my hundredths place, and I know that this is going to be between 200 and 300. I have 255 250 as my middle point between my hundredths here. 255 is just going to be a little bit past 250. 255 is going to be right about there. And so since it's past the 50, even though it's only past it by a little bit, it's still going to round to 300. So now let's take a look at 189. And I look at the 100 because that's the place value that it wants me to round to. And I know it's between 100 and my next 100, which is 200. Now again, we know that 150 is going to be in the middle, and we're going to use that as our benchmark to decide, are we going to round up to 200 or down to 100? So 80 is past the 150, so maybe 189 might be somewhere in that vicinity or that spot. So if we were to say, I want to round it to the closest 100, it's going to be closer to 200. So when I round and then I subtract, when I subtract 300 minus the 200, I'm going to get 100. So there are about 100 people that have, or there are about 100 between 300 to 200. So we're going to go to the next group of questions and think about, okay, number 3, 579. This time we're going to round to the closest 10 to estimate. So now we're going to work on not just looking at the hundreds place, but now we're going to look at the tens place. And to decide whether we round up or down, we're going to use the ones place. So now we have 579. We're going to subtract 214. This is our whole. This is the part. We are looking for our missing part, or the difference between 214 up to 579. How many would it take to get to that point? So, rounding to the closest 10, we have 570 or 580. Between those is 575. We know that we're past the 5 here in 575. Of course, it's going to be like right before 580 because it's 1 before 580, but it takes 9 to get to 570. So, rounded to the closest 10 is going to be 580. Now, 214 rounded to the closest 10. We look at the tens place. Don't forget, we're rounding to the closest 10. This is going to be between 210 and the next 10 after 210 is 220. So in between that group of tens is my 215. 214 is right before 215. So since it's closer to 214, that's the closest 10 that we rounded to. Okay? Now we can go ahead and subtract. So now we know that 500 minus 200s here, so we have 500s minus 200s. So 500 minus 200 is going to give us 300. And we subtract 80 minus 10, and that's going to give us 70. So when we put that back together as a standard number from expanded form to standard form, we get 370. Now, I know it's sometimes easier to write these up and down, but it's also a good idea to also think, because when we start working on algebraic equations in 5th and 6th grade, we see everything linear as opposed to algorithmic. So something to think about when we consider how we work out our problems. And this is, again, just using our number sense to help us understand place value and those place values going from here to here in our understanding of place value. So now I want to take you to number 4. And again, we're still rounding to the closest 10. And so if we take a look at number 4, this one might be a little tricky since it doesn't have a tens place, or a hundreds place, I mean. But hopefully it's not too confusing. So we have 216, round 216 to the closest 100. So, excuse me, to the closest 10. And so we have 210 and 220. 15 is going to be between that, 215, not just 15, but 215. So that tells us if we have 216, it's going to be 4 away from 220, but 6 away from 216. So we were going to round it to 220. We have 97. So if we look at the tens place, we have 90 as our 10, and 100 as the next 10. And even though it's 100, remember, it takes 10 tens to make 100. So when we're counting by tens, the next group of 10 after 90 is 100. So 95 is in between those group of tens, and 97 would be somewhere along that area. And if we were to say, okay, well, which one is it closer, 90 or 100, we would say it's much closer to 100. And so if we have 220 minus 100, we are going to take this 100 from here, which is my hundredths place, and 100 less than 220 is 120. So really, this is more of a mental strategy here where we could just subtract this 100 from our hundredths place. So we would have an estimate of 120. On number 5 and 6, it says to use compatible numbers. I want to stick with our estimation skill of rounding. Let's get rounding secure and ingrained in our brains and have that really strong, because it's a good skill that we need to have. So compatible numbers, we'll work on a little bit later, but I think for right now, let's work on rounding as our estimation skill. So if we want to go ahead and look at number 5, it says use compatible numbers to estimate each difference. Well, I want to switch that, and I want us to use rounding to the closest 10. I think we are going to get a better estimate if we start with rounding to the closest 10. So let's look at number 5. So if we look at number 5, we can round 328 to the closest 10, and we're going to subtract 207 from that. So again, we're estimating to the closest 10. So this tells us 320, or the next 10, which is 330. We look at our ones place, and we know that 325 is in between those groups of 10, and it's past 325. So since it's past 325, this is going to round to 330. Look at our tens place here. We don't have any tens. So what does that tell us? That this group of tens is going to be 200, and the next 10, 210. Sometimes this confuses people because we don't remember, or it's difficult to say, oh, well, we don't have any tens. But remember, 200 is one of those groups of tens, and 210 is the next 10. So 205 is in the middle. 207 might be right about there. And so since it's past 205, we know that we're going to round it to the closest 10, which is 210. So now, using what we know, we can subtract 300 minus 200, which is 100, and 30 minus 10, which is going to be 20, and we put that back into a standard number from expanded form to standard form, and that gives us a difference of 120 rounded to the nearest 10. Number 6, we're going to, again, look at 472, rounded to the closest 10, minus 148, rounded to the closest 10. Sometimes it's good to just remind ourselves by underlining the place value that we're rounding, just to make it solid in our understanding. So we are going to either round this to 470 or the next 10, which is 480. So we look at our ones place. We know that 475 is in between 470 and 480. So since it's between, we're going to say that it's between 470 and 480. We know that if 475 is in the middle, 472 might be right around there. We're going to round it to 470. Okay, so we have 470 minus, and we have 148. So 140 is going to be our focus. So it's either going to be it's going to either round to 140 or 150. Again, 5 is in the middle. Hopefully that's kind of been ingrained in you by now. 148 is past the 145 in our ones place. And so that tells us we're going to round to 150. So now we can subtract to find the difference between these two estimates of 470 and 150. So 400 minus 100 is 300, and 70 minus 50 is going to be 20, And when I put those two partial differences together, I'm sure you heard that last year in second grade, partial differences are going to add up to, or put back together as standard number of 320. So this is just estimating our differences. Remember, I'm not looking at exact differences yet. We are going to get to that skill a little later on and work towards that. But you're going to continue with this assignment on page 51, and you're going to continue it up to page 52. And I want you guys to work on the even numbers. Remember that in where it asks you to use compatible numbers, use rounding to the closest 10 instead of using compatible numbers. We'll get to that skill in estimating a little later on when we have a little bit more foundation with our rounding. And so go up to 28. If you have any other questions, we will go over this on Tuesday to kind of talk about how we're rounding to the closest tens and hundreds using estimation and our differences. So I hope this helps you. We are going to have a great week this week. So let's go ahead and work on some math. Have a great afternoon.